Well, good afternoon, folks. Welcome to day 2 of the 2022 Oregon Active Transportation Summit. My name is Andre Lightsey Walker. My pronouns are he, him, and I'm the Policy Transformation Manager at the Street Trust. I want to welcome you to using data to support transportation equity, successes and challenges. I'm honored to be joined by a wonderful team of folks from Espousal Strategies, Fabiola Casas, Jonelle Bell, and Jake War. And I haven't had any requests ahead of time, but I did want to quickly ask if folks had any visual impairments and may need additional descriptions of slides to just message me directly, and we can take care of that for you. Also, we'll be holding space for questions at the end. I do know that questions are fleeting, and so feel free, if it pops up in your head, to go ahead and drop it in the chat, and we'll save your place in line. And then we'll go ahead and get back to those questions at the end of the presentation. If any urgent concerns emerge, feel free to just send me a direct message, and we'll go from there. And if you're on the social media vibe, make sure to use the hashtag OATS22. So appreciate you all so much for being here. And I will go ahead and turn it over to Fabiola, Jonelle, and Jake. Thanks so much.
Great. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for the opportunity to present at this terrific, both in person as well as virtual, I think, workshop. So once again, Jonelle Bell, President, Founder of Espousal Strategies, and thrilled to be co-presenting with Jake as well as Fabiola. So Jake, if you want to go ahead and get our slides up, we'll kick off here. And as Jake is sort of generating the slides, what I would just encourage you all, if you have questions throughout or commentary throughout, we would welcome that. This is really meant to be a conversation, and we're hoping to have additional engagement towards the latter part of our presentation as well. So as was indicated, our talk today is really using data to further equity in transportation. We'll give some examples as to how we've done this on a number of projects that we're currently working on, as well as why it's important to be thinking about data within the context of equity as we think about not only transportation projects, but infrastructure projects writ large. So next slide, please. So we start off, it's really important to start off with just some basic grounding. And we start off with a question, which is, what is transportation equity? And how we like to conceptualize this is, it's really more than just compliance with federal requirements. Of course, we all know what those federal requirements are. You hear a lot about environmental justice. You hear a lot about the NEPA process. You hear a lot about Title VI. And oftentimes, when looking at transportation equity through the lens of sort of a compliance orientation, unfortunately, you're often thinking about just doing the bare minimum. So, for example, oftentimes you see in transportation projects that are federally funded, the notion of how do we minimize impact on historically marginalized communities, or how do we mitigate? And so when you're starting from a premise of mitigation and minimizing, you're not starting from what we would argue as a proactive approach, which is, how do you really leverage a transportation opportunity to invest in communities often left behind? This is also about access to the system itself, physical, financial, to the services and opportunities, for example, jobs that the system connects users to, for example, transit service levels and coverage. We know that access to affordable transportation is a great proxy to access to jobs and access to help folks get from poverty to prosperity. So transportation is really, really important within the context of equity. But it's also access for all users, with a particular focus on those most historically transportation disadvantaged. And that's what we'll talk more about today. Next slide. We pose a question, why center equity in transportation? We have some great examples as to what occurs when we don't think about equity within the context. And next slide, we'll start off. We don't have to go very far. So What you see here is an aerial image, probably in the 50s, of the Albina district. Albina, now also referred to sort of as the Rose Quarter district. And so this photo was taken prior to the advent of the interstate system. So prior to I-5, we go to the next photo. This happens after. You see where I-5 is and how I-5 just decimated what was once known as a bustling, very vibrant African-American community in Albina. So that's again before neighborhoods, also restaurants and businesses, and then go to the next slide, and this happens after. And so this, and what's fascinating about this, and you know, history doesn't always leave us, as ODOT has been grappling with how to advance the Rose Quarter project. They are grappling with this history, and what does it mean to do that project within the context of equity is a conversation the community has been having. Next slide. So this is an example of where it's really important to be thinking about data in terms of access, how transportation again creates access to opportunity. We've been doing a fair amount of this work as we think about, for example, the interstate bridge replacement. And so what this chart shows you is higher levels of spatial mismatch relative to low-income folks and access to jobs. And so the darker color denotes higher mismatch, whereas the lighter color is the converse in that. And so what you see there is in Baltimore core, where we have a lot of jobs, you don't have a lot of low-income folk living near those jobs. Jake, do you want to touch upon this a little bit more?
Sure, yeah, and just the opposite too, especially as folks are being pushed out to further reaches of cities and regions that where those jobs are not and still need to access job centers that require transportation infrastructure that's really not there in a lot of cases. So you end up with that mismatch.
Next slide, please. Another interesting chart. This is a percent of households without a vehicle by race and ethnicity. This is a little dated, 2019, but what you see in this chart, people of color overall, 14% without access to a vehicle, Black 18%. And this is through the National Equity Atlas, which is a really good resource if you've not taken a look at some of their other material. They have a lot of great work as well as a lot of great research labs. So what we know is a lack of access in transportation modal options for communities of color relative to their white counterparts. And again, what that means in terms of access to opportunity. And we also know that communities of color are disproportionately bearing the brunt of both mortality as well as hospitalization rates relative to pedestrian injuries and or fatalities. And so again, this chart denotes mortality. You see there African-American pretty significantly higher on both mortality as well as hospitalization. So this is really important as we start to think about conversations around safe routes to school, access to safe corridors. I know this is a big conversation relative to 82nd, and how we really think about equity through the lens of safety. And we know a lot of our communities, particularly communities of color, are living in corridors where safe access, safe crossings are not prevalent. And you see that bear out in a lot of these charts here. Next slide. Jake, I think I'm turning over to you at this point.
Thanks, Sean L. Yeah, so Sean L really set the stage of kind of the why behind why transportation is an equity issue, and some of the data that reflects those outcomes and that can be as serious as life and death. So if we can kind of flip that and use data to further equity, that is something that we do a lot of work in. And so I'm going to go over kind of what our approach is to that and some examples. So first, before I get into what we do, there are certainly limitations to what we're able to do given the amount of data, the types of data. So that there's a study fairly recently called Approaches and Barriers to Addressing Equity in Transportation, where the researchers spoke with transportation practitioners and said, what do you wish you could do? What are some of the challenges and barriers you run into? And the three themes that came across were they wanted more and better equity related data. There were challenges with accessing or collecting necessary and relevant data. And then there's a lack of metrics to kind of measure the outcomes of addressing equity. Just really demonstrates some of this is not hard science per se. And Fabiola is going to speak a bit more to this later. But just wanted to give that caveat before we get into the ways that we do kind of rely on data to try to get to equitable outcomes. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the types of data that are out there for transportation analysis generally, and perhaps equity analysis more specifically. But just listing here a few of the major sources that we tend to use when approaching a project and trying to support equitable outcomes and equitable transportation investments. We rely a lot on census data, of course. There are local sources. We're lucky here in this region to have the Metro Regional Land Inventory Survey. I forget what the S stands for, but a repository essentially of all this local data in terms of infrastructure, affordable housing, locations, schools, healthcare, et cetera. Schools and school districts can be a great source for stuff that you won't find elsewhere because they have their own data collection. Transportation system data itself, so that you're tying kind of the demographic pieces and the destination pieces to what the system is actually doing. You can look at infrastructure shape files in GIS, use GTFS, the General Transit Feed Specification. Shout out to Trillium people who are on this. Remix is a good tool that I'm sure that a lot of folks are familiar with. Surveys and studies, and just a variety of others. This is by no means a comprehensive list, but just generally kind of how an inventory a little bit of some of the tools we use. So the first example I'm going to talk about is at TriMet, and this is John L. and I were at TriMet and led the development of their Transit Equity Index. We worked with, there's a Transit Equity Advisory Committee made up of community members and representatives of community-based organizations. So we worked with them to identify a set of indicators that TriMet could use for prioritizing service investments, for evaluating where service cuts should or should not be made when that's necessary. So overall service planning, how can TriMet make service planning decisions in a way that is as equitable as possible? So through that process, we came up with 10 different indicators. Some of this had to do with data that was available. One piece that's a tricky one is, a big focus in the equity conversation is about houseless populations. And while there's a biannual or biennial every 2 years, whichever one that is, count of the houseless populations across the country and here locally as well, it doesn't get to that level of data where we know exactly where folks are living and exactly how to serve that population in a way that is hopefully a positive force in folks' lives. So there's some limitations, but we came up with these 10 indicators that 7 of them are based on demographics. And since it was a transit agency, we came to those from perspective of Title VI that focuses on populations of color and low-income populations, as well as limited English proficiency, but then some other ones as well, people with disabilities under ADA, and thinking about age and how folks are impacted by transit and how they ride transit based on age, but then also the destinations that folks are trying to get to, jobs, housing, and other services. And where this has been applied recently was when TriMet needed to cut some service down because of COVID-19, you might be familiar, is they looked at both ridership on routes, and they looked at these areas of the TriMet service district that scored high on this equity index. And they said, how can we cut the service in a way that doesn't disproportionately impact these communities that stand out from an equity perspective? So this map is showing where ridership was impacted, set on top of a map of that equity index. And then this map here is showing a similar thing, except for just focusing on the frequent routes. And so you do see a bit of a match there between frequency, or the frequent service routes that TriMet operates, and where populations live that are kind of stand out from an equity index perspective. So that helped them determine, how are we going to do this in a way that still serves the needs of those who rely on transit the most transit dependent, et cetera. So another project that we are on right now is the replacement of the interstate bridge, the I-5 bridge across the Columbia between Oregon and Washington. And so this is I'm sure many of you are following this in the news. So what we did is as a similar kind of approach with what John L. and I worked on at TriMet, we have an equity advisory group that we work with to actually define what equity means for this project. A lot of times you say the word equity, you'll get a million different definitions. Not a lot of agreement there some of the time. So we came up with a shared definition so that we're working from the same place, and came up with essentially a list of communities or demographics that we felt were priorities in terms of thinking about transportation impacts and thinking about community involvement and who needs to be involved from the community. So we came up with those demographics, and we used those for the most part. There was another limitation on houseless populations because they are listed in this definition, but not really great data to include them for data analysis, this type of data analysis. So combined these demographics, did a scoring system similar to how it's done at TriMet, and mapped it out relative to the project area. So this map is showing from an interactive map that was developed with a layer of showing the immediate project area, but also those areas that stand out from an equity perspective that are in the darker green. So they have higher concentrations of communities of color, low-income households, people with disabilities, and so on. And so you kind of see here in the downtown Vancouver core, it stands out a bit over here outside of the direct project area, but along its Fourth Plain Boulevard and below SR 500 on the Washington side, you see some of those communities that really stand out, and so stand to be presumably most impacted by the project. So that has informed our outreach. That's informed how we've screened different design options so far in the project. Of course, it's very early, but that's how it's been applied so far. And I'm going to turn it now to Fabiola to take it from here.
All right, thank you, Jake. So I want to share a bit about this project that I've been helping manage. It's the Washington County Major Streets Transportation Improvement Program, also known as MISTIP or MSTIP. And I'm just going to read the description of what it is. So it's the county's property tax funded road improvement program. Program funds are allocated approximately every 6 years to construct and or implement a prioritized list of projects. So those projects are coming from the cities within Washington County or Washington County itself to account for unincorporated parts of Washington County. And so public input is essential in guiding MISTIP investment to meet community needs. And this is a big shift that's happened in this round of this process of determining projects to prioritize. In the past, it hasn't been as robust of an engagement process, and in particular, to have it equity centered is something that's new this year. MISTIP engagement includes opportunities for community to develop or refine program guiding principles and criteria that will shape the projects funded through the program, and again, to help develop a prioritized list of projects. So in this work, the first step that we took was to develop an equity framework, really building off of the work that we've been leading with the Interstate Bridge Replacement Program and other work that John Ellen and Jake have led in the past. And so the framework, some of the major components of the framework included equity definitions, as Jake said, to kind of get us on the same page as to what we mean when we talk about equity and transportation equity. We established some guiding principles and objectives. It included a demographic analysis, and we identified some key tools and strategies to help operationalize this, what we mean by embedding equity or centering equity in this work. And so the tools and strategies that we identified were both to inform the engagement, as well as using a similar to the equity index, which is a tool that we've used to inform the technical evaluation process. And so here on the screen, I just have a couple images to share that, in Washington County, a priority community or folks, Latinx folks who speak Spanish. And so that resulted in us hosting a Spanish, it was bilingual, but it was primarily in Spanish with English interpretation, a listening session back in January. And on the left, you see an image of the introductory slide for that event. And then to the right is an image of the evaluation metrics that have resulted from our process. So these evaluation metrics are going to be used to evaluate the lists that are submitted by the different jurisdictions for consideration. And what you see is that there's a table, and on the left side of the table is an evaluation metric, and on the right side is a column that has which outcomes that have been determined as priorities are addressed by the metric. So how are we measuring these outcomes? And the outcomes that you see listed are, or that we have listed here, are equity, economic, well, it's not a comprehensive list. So just as an example, I'm reading off from the first row. So you'll see equity as one of the outcomes that is included in all of the columns that are shown on this table here. There's a few additional metrics as well, and most of them include equity, but not all of them. And so then the question is, well, how are we going to measure, right, whether we're achieving equitable outcomes in these different categories? And so the tool that has been helping guide that process has been, as I said, the equity index. So if you want to go to the next slide, Jake, what you'll see here is our indicators that were used to help in the development of this equity index, which was tailored to this specific project. These were developed in collaboration with the project team at Washington County, and helping us identify which indicators were most important to include in this specific index. So this combined demographics, destinations, and infrastructure to match where equity priority communities across Washington County live and work, and where transportation is lacking. So like other equity indices that we've used in the past, census block groups were scored based on these various indicators, with higher scores meaning that those areas should be considered priority areas for proposed transportation for these proposed transportation projects and investments. And on the next slide, you'll just see an image of what that ends up looking like visually. And so this shows a map of Washington County, or including Washington County, and with the different indices scored and layered, the different shades indicate where there are, I guess, we're interpreting where the priority areas are, with the darker shades being higher priority and the lighter shades being less of the priority on that scale. So that, all right, so I think that's what I have for MISTIP. And I'm just gonna go into talking a bit about, I think what in a lot of the, in this work in the transportation world, folks are very, very drawn to numbers and quantifying things and measuring things as precisely as possible. And while that is really, those are really valuable tools to be able to have access to large amounts of data and to be able to measure and quantify things, there are some limitations that we have to keep in mind as we're making sense of what the numbers tell us. And so here we just have listed limitations from our perspective of the quantitative data that we have available for equity purposes. And Jake earlier, I talked a bit about this. And so I'll go I'll first mention that on the right-hand side, there's a snippet from a New York Times article that's titled 2020 Census Undercounted Hispanic, Black, and Native American Residents. And underneath that title, it says, the Census Bureau said that the overall population total was accurate, but that counts of minorities were skewed. Advocacy groups threatened to go to court. And so, as we think about the accuracy of the numbers and the data that we have available, some things that, as I was thinking about this, that came to mind for us to consider and that I wanted to share is that a lot of the institutions, so, for example, the Census Bureau or other institutions and organizations that are leading the collection of quantitative data have historically and currently often used this data for exclusionary or otherwise harmful purposes that have led to the marginalization of certain groups. And so because of this, many people from these groups may be suspicious around the data collector's intent and the use of the information, and often are unwilling to provide it. So there's a lot of work right now happening to be able to rebuild that trust. Other barriers that affect the accuracy of the data that we have available include potentially not meeting language needs, cognitive or physical ability, and being able to meet the needs of folks there. Access to, especially now, access to technology, or I should say kind of a growing gap in folks that have access to the technology needed to be included. And or simply the time that folks have available to fill out surveys or forms or however folks are collecting this data. More and more, people's time is really stretched. And so sometimes that's a barrier that affects the accuracy. For bias, even though we're looking at numbers and allocating numbers to information that we're collecting, it does still require a level of interpretation to make sense of the information that we have available. And so whoever is leading that process or part of that process, it really is impossible to be free of our personal biases, and even as a group. So right now I know that there's a lot of work around research equity and who is leading this, the collection and interpretation, even of quantitative data. And so that's something to keep in mind. The third point here is level of detail or granularity that's available. And so this is just speaking to, being able to, the limits of not being able to get to the personal level impacts of the numbers that, or the information that we're looking at. So often with just using the census as an example, you can only get to a certain level of detail in the information that you're seeking. You're not able to look at information per household, which would be really, really difficult to do due to the scale of the information that's being collected. And so while we can get kind of broad strokes patterns or kind of takeaways or themes from the information that we have available, we really are missing that the granular detail that sometimes we need to kind of have a full picture of what's going on. And lastly is just referring back to what Jake said about the need to have more and better data for the being able to have metrics that are consistent and that are that help us really measure the equity, the impacts for equity efforts that are underway. This is all relatively new, and that's the case across many fields, but we're just needing to keep that in mind for the processes and the experience that's available within transportation planning and technical design processes. And on the next one's my last slide here. So we're talking about opportunities and limitations of qualitative data. And so here so qualitative data, I'm sure folks in this room are familiar, but I just feel like it's important to state what it is. So qualitative data being the information that cannot be expressed as a number. So what's included in qualitative data are words, objects, pictures, observations, and symbols. And so when we're looking at, these types of, at these elements of us collecting information, often there's a depth because of its subjectivity. There's a depth that we go into describing something or describing what we're observing or making sense of a picture. And so the depth over kind of the breadth of looking at a lot of information at once specifically through numbers, that helps us, create stories that are compelling. And something that I wanted to highlight with that is just that compelling stories are a key part of policy and other decision-making processes. Because we are people at the end of the day that are making decisions and not machines, the power of storytelling is something that can't be understated. Anecdotes and observations can often also illuminate new concepts to explore further on a larger scale. So often personal observation or kind of these anecdotes are the origin of large scale research. And as I was thinking about this, I think about even just, what came to mind was thinking about Newton, sitting and having the apple fall on his head. And then that was qualitative data. He was making an observation of what was happening. And that was really the seed to large scale study about what gravity is. And so that just kind of helped me kind of conceptualize what the power of qualitative data and observation especially. And in terms of limitations of qualitative data, there's quite a bit more subjectivity and analysis, and that can be time consuming, so on the one hand, because we have less control over the data that's coming in, there's a greater need for interpretation, and that can be really time consuming. I'm taking a look at time, so I'll make this last part brief so we can get to questions. But I'll just mention that in the work that we've done, something that we're when it comes to collecting qualitative data, that's coming out of us hosting listening sessions, community dialogues, focus groups, community workshops. So we gather, we gather information, we take notes about what we hear, the stories that we hear, what we observe, and the dynamics of what went on in this space, and we have to make sense of it. And that can be pretty challenging but also really powerful. And so it's through a lot of these community engagement efforts that are more and more sought after, where we need to kind of strengthen and have a deeper understanding of how to make the best use of the qualitative data that we have to really inform the decisions that are being made to be able to further equitable outcomes. So I'll leave it there. And I think I saw some questions maybe in the chat. So would love to get to those.
And I will quickly invite folks who did ask questions to turn on your mic if you're comfortable and just go ahead and read out the question. So Ken, you'd be up.
Hey, everybody. Thanks. Yeah, I'm just wondering, as we work through our various social equity indexes at ODOT, how did you all deal with some of the margins of error that come out? I know you touched on that a little bit on the slide, but was that a determining factor on whether or not to include certain demographic variables in your index?
So that's a great point to raise. It makes any of the American Community Survey data, as you know, come with a pretty big grain of salt. So it kind of yes and no, I would say, as far as our willingness to include them. There's we've kind of taken the approach of it's as good as what we've got. And as long as we're layering on multiple data points and we're not trying to get down to like this particular street, you know, has these characteristics, and that we're not overselling, I guess, this as anything more than kind of indicators. Like this is not the gospel of where people live and what the exact characteristics of those neighborhoods are, but they seem to be indicators. And then if we're try not to go with projects like too small of a geographic area to make conclusions about, in particular, things like language data. Language can be pretty problematic, language and disability data, given that those are only available at the smallest scale of the census tract. So it's kind of I would say mostly we've kind of just accepted so far that those margins of error are there. It's the best we've got. And until there's a better solution, you know, we've got to really complement and fill those gaps with other sources.
Well, and I think the additional layer to that is ensuring that all of this data, it tells one story, but it's so critically important to do this work effectively, to have robust engagement as well, to where we are out talking to these various communities, hearing the qualitative stories. And it's sort of the holistic picture of both the quantitative and qualitative that tells a better picture in terms of sort of inequities that exist in our communities.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, that's similarly how we have felt about it too. We're more in the user sphere, so that's helpful. Thanks.
And I now want to invite Rob Sadowski. You want to go ahead and ask your question?
Yeah, thanks. Hi, I'm Rob. I use the pronouns he, him. I'm from Clackamas County's Department of Transportation Development. Is there a regional data share location, like a collaborative place that people are starting to put things like, whether it's ArcView maps or vector maps or other data that we can access so we don't have to start from scratch?
I know that, I mean, there's sources from different, not all in one place, like one map per se, but like the Metro RLIS has a lot of different shape files and data. And then for a good example of a publicly accessible one, so Washington County, for the Major Streets Transportation Improvement Program, they have a public site, and I'm looking for the link now so that you can go there. But that's becoming, and I showed a screenshot from Interstate Bridge Replacement, where that is really where this is going, of people being able to themselves go in and interact with the data. So yeah, we're thinking the same way.
Awesome. And I know you all had some discussion questions. We've got about 4 minutes. Was there one that kind of raised to the top? And is 4 minutes enough to engage in that?
Jake, I think you're muted. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah. So I think the one that would be most interested in hearing is about folks' experience using data for equity analysis. What challenges you've run into, if you've used some additional sources that we didn't talk about here. Just kind of want to hear what the experience has been for others in the room.
I can confirm that we've got a few data experts in this room right now. So you know who you all are, so I invite you to contribute.
I'm happy to answer the question that popped up in the chat. So the question here says, I have a question about the matrix Fabiola was showing with evaluation matrix. So Amanda, yeah, I'd love to.
Oh yeah, sorry, I didn't want to derail from the question you posed to us, but I did have a question about the matrix that you were showing. You had the evaluation metrics, and then you also had the outcomes. I was curious though, if you also have like what either quantitative or qualitative data components you are connecting to those evaluation metrics, like when you're saying like you had one about like how are you determining, what data are you using to show that there are improvements? How do we define that?
Yeah, so through the different work sessions that have been held, folks have kind of brainstormed what are the data sources that we're using for each of the metrics in the for each of the metrics. So we do have that available. That the table that I showed is what was presented at a Board of County Commissioners and what they looked at. If you're interested in getting kind of the full evaluation metrics, I'd be happy to check with the county's project manager to see if that's something that I can share out. So I will put my email in the chat, and feel free to just reach out and I'll see what I'm able to share with you all.
I appreciate that. And I think that actually segues greatly. So if folks did have additional questions or wanted to get in contact with you all, is email just the best platform? And if so, could you just drop your emails in the chat? I thank you all so very much, and everyone for tuning in today. Feeling really excited about the ways we can use data to transform our actual lived experiences. So appreciate the great work.